Well, hello and welcome to the 10-minute Bible study. Today is part 2. We couldn't get all of the bleeding woman and Jairus' story in one 10-minute Bible study. So in part 1, we looked at the story of the bleeding woman. Today we're going to pick it up with Jairus' daughter. Grab a Bible, Mark chapter 5, and let's dive in.
And while he was still speaking, this is verse 35, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Can you imagine what it might have felt like to be Jairus in this moment? He's done everything right. He's run to Jesus. He's fallen at his feet. He's begged him. And Jesus has agreed they're going. And yet along the way, Jesus stops because a woman touches him in a really busy crowd, and he hears her whole story. And while Jesus is dawdling with the woman, answering her need, speaking to her need, news comes that all is lost. This verse always speaks to me. And here's why. It often feels like to me that God is answering everybody else's prayers but mine. And I cannot help but believe that that is probably what Jairus felt in that moment. Jairus watches Jesus heal the woman. And while he spends the time doing that, he loses his daughter. He's done everything right, and now it seems like it's too late. Verse 36, Jesus writes, "But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue," again, he's emphasizing his title, "Do not fear, only believe." All right, pay attention to that because we've got a repetition again. Mark uses repetition often to drive home a point. And so when you see a word turn up again and again, you got to pay attention to it. Just as we saw that both Jairus in verse 22 and the bleeding woman in verse 33 fell at Jesus' feet, here we see those same words again, fear and believe. The woman comes to Jesus in verse 33 in fear. And Jesus tells her in verse 34, "Your faith has made you well." Likewise here, Jesus says in verse 36, "Do not fear, instead believe." Replace the negative thing, fear, with the positive thing, faith. You've already seen me heal this woman, Jairus. Hold on and trust me. Stick with me, even though it may feel like right now your prayers have not been answered. And so Jesus, in verse 37, allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. "The girl is dead." Everyone knows that she's dead. They're now mourning. And when Jesus had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. All right, really quickly, this is worth paying attention to. What Jesus does here is he takes those with faith and he brings them inside the house. And he takes those who don't have faith, those who laughed at him, and he puts them outside the house. Mark does this on purpose. He's taking the outsiders and bringing them in, and the insiders, and he's putting them out. There's a physical representation of what's actually happening here spiritually. And Jesus, taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Talitha kumi, which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Arise, that is the same word for resurrection. Of course, this is not a resurrection the way that Jesus would be resurrected. She doesn't have a transformed body, a new body like that Paul describes, and yet she is brought back. It's a foretaste of what's to come in Christ. Immediately, the girl got up. It happens instantly. She responds. There's that word again. And she began walking. Now, do you see how old the girl is? The girl's 12 years old. The woman with the flow of blood, how long had she been sick for? 12 years. There's an echo through both of these stories pointing us to the same thing. This girl who is just coming of age is given new life, just as the bleeding woman who had been sick for so long is given new life. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. A few closing thoughts there in that last verse. Jesus let the whole crowd hear the woman's story. Everybody got to witness that. And just in our previous episode, we saw that Jesus told the man with the legion of demons to go and tell, but in this instance, this is a new revelation. Jesus isn't ready yet for that information to get out. If you've been following along with me in the Gospel of Mark, you'll know that Jesus sometimes, frequently actually, charges those who have been healed, or charges demons, not to tell anybody. And he does this because he wants to reveal himself, his identity on his terms, and his timeline. But we're beginning to see a change here. Jesus is beginning to reveal more of himself. He did it in the last episode with the Gentiles. Go and tell the Gentiles. The bleeding woman, not a secret. And yet this is a little bit even more revelation, that Jesus has power even over death, and he's not ready for that word to get out. Now, what's up with the getting something to eat? We actually see this in the end of Luke's gospel when Jesus eats fish with his disciples. He's been raised from the dead and he has something to eat. And here's why this is important. Mark wants to make sure that we know that this isn't a spiritual raising. She wasn't just a ghost. She was bodily raised from the dead. And that's why Luke, in the end of his gospel, makes sure that Jesus eats fish and that they touch his side. He wants to make clear to the readers of his gospel that Jesus was not a ghost. It wasn't a spiritual resurrection, but a physical, bodily one. Likewise here, this girl was physically raised from the dead. Here's where I'd like to close this week. Jairus might have been tempted to lose faith. In fact, I'm sure he was. He had done everything right. He had seen Jesus heal this woman. And yet, while waiting, his daughter dies. And yet, he sticks close with Jesus when Jesus doesn't answer his prayer the way that he wanted or the way that he expected. He stuck with Jesus. And because he stuck with Jesus, he actually got to see and participate in something even better that he would have missed, something that he couldn't have imagined. There was no framework for resurrection. This was something entirely new. And so, friends, here's how I'd like to encourage you this week. There will be times when Jesus does not answer your prayers the way that you hope, the way that you expect. He doesn't answer them on your terms or on your timeline. And yet the text teaches us to stick close to him, to stay close to his side, because he does answer. It's just often not in the way that we expect. And when we stick with him, we end up seeing him do something even greater than we would have otherwise. Likewise, you might be like the bleeding woman, and you have suffered for a long time. For her, it's been 12 years, an eternity. And yet Jesus still gives her what she needs and more. He gives her a healing touch physically, but he also calls her, the nameless woman, daughter. He hears her whole story. He sees her. And friends, it certainly would have been easier for her if she had never gotten sick, or if God had healed her a long time ago. And yet, in that waiting, Jesus still met her, and he met her in a way that would have been beyond her wildest imaginations. So friends, it's an invitation to persevere, to trust Jesus, that he works on his timeline and on his terms, and that what he has for those who come to him, who humbly seek him, who persist with him, who wait on him, is far better than anything we might otherwise even know to ask for or could imagine. Thanks so much for joining me in this week's episode of the 10-Minute Bible Study. If this was helpful for you, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, and I'll see you soon.